Okay, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Hope you enjoyed your lunch, fresh and ready to go for this afternoon. And I think it's going to be very interesting indeed. We've got two sessions before the coffee break. Now, the first one is a presentation by Declan Hill, who is an academic and a journalist and the world's foremost expert when it comes to match fixing and betting-related corruption, and the author of The Insider's Guide to Match Fixing in Football, which I urge any of you to read if you've got even a passing interest in this stuff. It's fascinating. So Declan's going to talk to us for half an hour, and then we're going to keep Declan on the stage and ask him some more questions along with some other experts from the sports and betting worlds to dig into a bit more detail about how the industry can protect the integrity of sports whilst having a flourishing betting sector. So, Declan, welcome. Over to you.
Thanks, mate. Latin we het belangrijkste vooropstellen. Let's start with the important things. Ik ben een Canadense. Most of you are Dutch, and we share a common history. We share one year when our history was inextricably intertwined. Now, most of those times we don't speak about it, we just know it. But today, 6th of June, 2019, is 75 years since that day that year began. 75 years ago, my people, as you know, were hundreds of miles away on a beach, beginning a process where you guys would join us and we would liberate this country. This isn't the time or place to go into this, but I want to acknowledge this moment because this is almost the last year when we'll have those people around. And I also want to acknowledge that we're about to kick off an important conversation about the future of the Netherlands, about the future of your society, the future of your sport, the future of gambling addiction, the future of profitability for many of your companies. But there's not a person in this room that doesn't know that this conversation is nothing compared to what our grandparents and our parents faced in that year when our history was intertwined.
You know, I'm not going to sugarcoat anything. That life at times is a violent life, and if you had to use the threat of violence or violence itself to get your jobs done, you do it. And you know, unfortunately, I know of cases where an athlete was put in a hospital, you know, or handicapped in a way that he couldn't play the game. It happens. I'm Michael Francis, and for almost 20 years of my life, I was a made man in the Colombo crime family in New York, one of the 5 New York La Cosa Nostra families. I was involved in gambling. I had a major gambling operation. When you're involved in that life, some way, somehow, you're involved in gambling. And I had, at any point in time, 12 or 13 bookmakers working for me. Obviously, their targets were always athletes. They're pretty easy to exploit. And, you know, to me, it was great. I mean, great business. I mean, you know, we can get athletes going along with us to compromise the outcome of a game. Terrific, because there was big money in it. So it was major business for me. We know in life it says that when you borrow money, you become a slave to the lender. Well, when you're an athlete and you get involved with a gambler, you become a slave to the fixer. It's the same thing. You're going to do his bidding. Once you cross that line, do one thing for that gambler, you become his slave. You know, we used to hang out in some of the clubs, you know, in Manhattan, Brooklyn, where a lot of the college teams would come in and play. St. John's, some of the major universities. And a lot of these basketball players would go to the same clubs. They like to hang out. They like to party. Mob guys love to party. We live for that. And we'd get our eye on one or two of the guys and wine them and dine them. Hey, come on over to the table with your friends, sit down, have a bite to eat, bring a few women over, give them attention. And these are women that we knew, probably we had something to do at the club most of the time. And you kind of bring this along once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. Finally, you set them up for the conversation because we're friends now. Yeah, sit down, let me talk to you. I said, listen, you're a smart guy. I'm your good friend. Let me tell you how you're going to make some money. 10 grand in my pocket, pull it out, put it on a table in front of them. More money than they ever seen in cash in their life. Once we get it, they get into us, so to speak. Then they do whatever they're told to do, and that's it. And inevitably, the scenario that I just described, it always turns, and the way it'll turn is this. Athletes have a harder time underperforming than they do overperforming, because they're athletes at heart, and especially these young kids in college. These are not criminals right off the bat. These are young kids. And it gets into their heads. And eventually they'll come back and say, you know what, I got 20 grand, 30 grand, 40 grand. I can't do this anymore. It's getting to me. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And my response was always the same. Excuse me, we had a deal. You don't break your word with me. You got 10 games to go. You're done when I tell you you're done. That's it. Again, there's no love relationship between a mob guy and whoever their player is, or their pawn, or whoever it is. They're there to make money, and that's it. I've been to every Major League Baseball team, most of the NFL, all the NBA, and over 400 universities here in America, and spoke to every student athlete. You would be surprised how naive these people are. They know what they're doing on the field, but they're very naive when it comes to the business of gambling. When I do a football team, I'll get the biggest guy in usually a guard, or tackle. I said, stand up. They get all nervous. I said, stand up. What are you worried about? You're 3 times my size. Stand up. And they'll stand up, and I'll say, you're pretty good on the field. I wouldn't match up with you in any way, shape, or form. I said, but I'll tell you what. You cross this line, and you come into my business, the business of gambling, I said, I'll make a sissy out of you. I said, because I don't play by the rules, and I'm not afraid to hurt you, and I ain't going to fight you. I said, I'll get you the way I got to get you. I said, so you don't want to know somebody like me.
Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Francis is old school. His form of match fixing is something out of the last century. Guys at the back of the bar, the New York mob, the Lucchese's, the Genovese's, the South Philly mob fixing, as you know, David. But we're here to talk about something else. We're here to talk about what's going on now in 2019 and the problems of a failed war against match fixing. The fact that in the 14 years since I first raised this issue in a stage very similar to this, an international conference in Copenhagen, talking about the tsunami of match fixing that was to come out of Asia, we're still battling it. So we'll talk about this scenario now. We'll also pay homage to all the good people that are fighting this war, all the extraordinary activity that we've done, but we're still looking at a situation where we're not winning this war. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Talk a little bit about the challenges to Dutch sport as you guys walk into this world of privatized gambling. How are you going to work on this? What are your 3 main challenges? And then, most importantly, we're going to talk about how to win the fight here in the Netherlands. How to kick their ass, if you excuse my strong language, out of this country and make sure it never gets established here. Leave it to the Belgians. You want corruption? The Belgians do it so well. But not here in the Netherlands. And it's really simple. This is why I speak about a failed war. 90% of match fixing is very easily preventable with a few minor tweaks, or relatively minor tweaks. So, let's walk our way through that. Let's also have some fun. I know the beginning is quite intense, but let's have some fun. Let's enjoy ourselves, laugh. It's right after lunch. I've got a few jokes to tell, aside from picking on the Belgians. Right. Let's take a quick look at the European countries that have had national police investigations into match fixing since 2011. And you'll see that most of the continent turns red. In fact, the question is not which of the countries are red, it's the question of which of the countries are not red? I have a longer presentation where I talk about each one of these cases, but we don't want to really get into that. You'll see that I made this slide a number of years ago, and we've already seen in the Netherlands, my colleagues at Volkskrant showed the extent of the match fixing in the 2009-2010 season here in the Netherlands. In Portugal, I think most of you know the story of how the Russian mafia, working with a Chinese guy, Eric Mao, was working a particular club whose business essentially was match fixing. Switzerland had a failed attempt to prosecute match fixing, failed at the final stages. Bulgaria, Albania have all had match fixing going on. The life expectancy of football club owners in Bulgaria is roughly the equivalent of Chinese coal miners. They keep getting assassinated with single sniper shots as they're walking to the streets of Sofia. Bulgaria's match fixing is endemic. Albania's is even worse if possible. There's a number of match fixing investigators from UEFA, the most powerful sporting organization in Europe, that picked up death threats or received death threats, well-substantiated, credible death threats, at the airport in Albania. As they arrived in Tirana, they came through the thing, they checked their mobile phones saying, hey guys, why don't you go home or you'll be dead. They drove about half an hour into Tirana and they decided, you know what, we're going to go back. Georgia, Armenia, Ukraine, Moldova, Ireland, Wales have all had match-fixing investigations. So really, the only places that haven't had match-fixing now are Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan. And I would argue, and Belarus, and I would argue that that's more a statement of the lack of willingness on the part of the officials than it is that there's not very much corruption there. As you know, or I'm sorry, please excuse me, as some of you know, what I did when I was receiving my doctorate at the University of Oxford was go to Singapore and Thailand and Indonesia, and I was taken in to a gang of match fixers. A few years after that, that gang was revealed as Dan Tan's group, and they showed me how they were fixing key games at the 2006 World Cup. I wrote a book about it called The Fix. It's now in 21 languages and is just being optioned by Apple TV as an international television series. But for our purpose, this is a list of all the games that just that one gang fixed. And when I say that this is a list that's not just what they told me, because talk is cheap when you're talking with match fixers. Boasts and drunken claims. But this is the stuff that have been credibly endorsed by officials inside the football world saying, yes, there were fixed matches. Up to and including the bottom title, which is the Men's World Cup. FIFA's former security director came out publicly a number of years ago and said, you know what, we've had fixed matches at the World Cup. So this is really the breadth and extent, and that's almost every single level of international football has been affected in some ways by just one gang. The reason why I emphasize just one gang is there's a great story told to me by some European police officers who said they had a key match fixer in their room with them, in the interrogation room with them. They were at the desk here, the other side of the desk was this guy, and they said, look, we got you banged to rights, as the Brits say. We've got you. We've got you guys on tape. We've been monitoring your phones, your movements for the last 11 months. Half your gang has flipped over and are now working as prosecution witnesses, so you may as well tell us everything you know. Like, let's just cut it quick. And this guy has a long moment of silence, and then he goes, okay, you're right. You got me. I'll tell you everything that you want to know. Anything you want to know, except about the Russians. Because if I talk to you about the Russians, they won't just kill me. They'll come after my family. They'll come after my friends. So you get everything except the Russians. So that is a list of just what Dan Tan's guys were able to do. And the knowledge is out there that there's a whole bunch of other gangs. I don't want to exaggerate. I don't think there's more than a dozen or so major match-fixing operations going on. It's not 50, 60. It's 12 strong, interconnected gangs that are working. But it does still have power and reach. Again, as we all know, it's not just football. I tend to focus on football. It's a sport that I'm passionate about. But tennis is, of course, the easiest game to fix. The Independent Review of Integrity in Tennis came out last spring. And I think, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if you guys can, at the back, can see this yellow highlighted thing. I'll read it for you. I'm sorry about that. A Tennis Integrity Unit investigator described the extent of the problem at some lower level events as a tsunami. The evidence indicates that within these levels, the problem is greater at men's events than at women's events. And the problem is greater at $15,000 events than at $25,000 events. So he's talking about that extent of match corruption and spot fixing inside the lower levels of tennis. However, as you can see in this kind of stuff, at the beginning rounds, at the opening rounds of some of these major tournaments, you're starting to get the shark bites, those little nibbles, the piranha bites of corruption in some of those levels. This is a superb piece of work. It's by FIFPro, the Football Players Union. 7 years ago, they did a survey of 9 countries in former Soviet and Eastern Europe. You can see the statistics there. They're pretty shocking. 1 in 4 had direct knowledge of match corruption. 1 in 10 of those players, of over 3,300 people that they approached, said, we have direct knowledge. Like they were approaching us or we participated directly. The interesting point is the last point here. Many players outside the group surveyed would not participate. So we can presume that people who said, we're not going to participate, you nuts? This is too crazy for us. Would have put those numbers up even higher. I wouldn't be belaboring this. I mean, it's pretty easy stuff. It's like shooting fish in a barrel if we weren't not winning. This is a headline from my colleagues in a Spanish newspaper of June the 2nd. It speaks of 7 players who were bought, including Raúl Bravo, one of their former Spanish national team players. That is still making its way through the courts. God willing, the man is innocent, and that all the tape transcripts and all the conversations that the Spanish police have of them and of this, quote, organized crime gang are all completely accidental, and the man is innocent. However, we also have problems, of course, in Belgium. You've all seen the match-fixing investigation that kicked off last fall in Belgium. The Danish are doing investigations involving matches that have just finished. There's stuff coming up in France, Sweden. Some of you guys have seen the Honduras versus Norway under 20, 12-0 game that happened a couple of weeks ago. And I'm picking on those countries, unlike Iran, where they also had problems, because these are essentially compatible countries with the Netherlands. These are countries that we can compare ourselves with and say, hang on a second, something's not going right. I do want to take one moment, because I'm putting this in deliberately pessimistic terms. I'm saying, look, 14 years after this issue started to come up, after we identified some really quick, easy solutions to this, match fixing is still at a serious level. But in no way do I want to make it look as if no one is actually fighting against this and that nobody is in good faith struggling to combat this. There are lots of good, honest, decent people that are doing it. It's just that for various reasons, many of which I don't have time to discuss this afternoon, I'd be here till 6 o'clock, this war is failing. So how do we prevent this stuff from happening in the Netherlands? How do we put a firm Dutch dam against a canal of corruption? There are 3 issues that we've got to tackle full on. Particularly anybody here who's in the gambling industry, you just got to come up and say, how are we going to deal with this? Honestly and straightforward. The first is gambling addiction, particularly among young athletes. My new friend David and I, David from America, some of you guys know him, he and I were talking about the prevalence of gambling addiction among English Premier League players. Even now in 2019, 6 years after the gambling prohibition on them, they're still endemic levels. Money laundering, and finally the subject that I'm an expert in, match fixing and sport corruption. I'm going to leave those other two to you guys because the ladies and gentlemen in this room, because there are people who will know better than me how to tackle money laundering and how to tackle gambling addiction. I'm just raising the issue saying we got to discuss it, because if we don't discuss it, our opponents at some point will grab hold of it and they'll start discussing it. So we need to come up with the issues and we need to deal with them. Let's have a little bit of fun. This is footage, verbatim footage from the Nigeria versus Scotland game of last year.
Audio Jungle.
Right. Anyone need an explanation as to what was going on there? I like that thing, because nothing can more dramatically indicate the failure of FIFA and football officials to seriously address this issue. Because no one in this video has ever been sanctioned for that event. And it shows fully and clearly the gap between the words and the cliches and the public pronouncements and what actually happens when you can have something as direct and clear as that, and there's never a sanction. Excuse me, there's not a sanction for those guys. It's clear indication that something is wrong in the farm. So let me wrap up before we get to the panel discussion with a run-through on how to win the fight, how to make sure that here in the Netherlands we win this one. First of all, let's stop the bullshit. Like, let's have one set of rules for all. And if you don't follow those rules, get out. You're not allowed to come in. Now, please, if there's a representative of SBO Bet, please tell me that you're based in the UK. Please tell me that you pay your fair share of taxes and that you employ people in that tax regime. Because if you can't, why is SBO Bet got the same privileges, they're sponsoring West Ham, the English Premier League football team, as a European-based gambling operation that pays taxes, that has socially responsible gaming, that has anti-money laundering, that shares their information with the relevant and proper officials? How come offshore bookmakers are allowed to come into Europe? It's unfair. There has to be one set of rules. And the sports officials have to hold on to those rules. They can't complain bitterly about gambling and betting and then take sponsorship money from companies that aren't following the same rules. So one set of rules for all. 2, a revolution in tournament incentives, and this is deeply boring, but this is why I say 90% of match fixing is 90% of the time preventable. Italian last 2-3 games of the Italian league, there's always fixing, and everybody in this room knows it. In fact, many of you guys in this room have taken games off the betting charts because we know what's going to happen. Il sistema, the system, where a team really needs the points either to win the championship or not get relegated to Serie C or Serie B, pays a middle-ranking team to whom the points mean nothing for those points. And it's a gray market. It's the system. And everybody inside Italian football, almost everybody inside Italian football knows of that system. And they have the same word for it in Portuguese football. And they have the same word for a similar word for it in Greek and Turkish football and many leagues in Europe. And there's a very simple solution. Playoffs. You take at a certain point in the season, towards the end, and you make the bottom 6 teams play against each other in a win-lose situation. In no way do I want to pick on just the Italian, Greeks, and Southern Europeans. Again, not to single David out, but David and I were just talking about North American sports, and I want to return to that subject. But David and I, as North Americans, are well used to institutionalized fixing. It's called tanking. And tanking is a well-honored time-bound cultural thing where NBA and NFL teams and NHL will start to lose games to get the better draft pick the next year. This stuff can be taken out by math geeks in an afternoon. You just have to reschedule your tournament so that you don't have these games that don't matter, where there's a disparity of desire for one team. Sorry, there's no photo for this one. We need the sharing of the benefits. If we're going to bring in a new world of sports gambling and liberalize sports gambling, and we bring in more money and more sponsorship money, we've got to find a system where it gets down to the individual athletes. It doesn't stay up at the top of the sports officials. We've got to figure out a way of equitable distribution. And this is a fantastic selling point for you guys. As the debate goes on, you say, we want to get this. We want to get some of the money into the hands of the poorer athletes, the people who are most at risk of corruption. We want to back them, we want to support them, and we want to do it. And it's much cheaper than by doing it to the sponsor things. Finally, and this is the most important thing, we need to set up in the Netherlands a well-resourced national agency dedicated to fighting all sports corruption. I know there's already an embryonic agency here in the Netherlands which is purportedly doing that, but nobody says that they're well-resourced. And they certainly cannot handle sex abuse and doping and match fixing and corruption. They simply don't have the cash, they don't have the resources to do it. And it takes the initiative, it takes the energy that you guys, many of you guys in gambling companies have to do off your shoulders. You say, look, we'll pay a certain very small percentage. We'll set up that national agency. It's not in conflict of interest with us. It's not in conflict of interest with the sports people. We can do it, and we will protect all of sports in the Netherlands. The national agency would include these 5 basic things. One is a whistleblower hotline and a computer app for that athletes and coaches and people involved inside the game can report corruption. It also talks about research into gambling addiction or all addiction among athletes. Does anyone recognize this photo? Is anyone from the UK here that lived through the 90s? Do you remember this? Can you tell what these photos are? Sorry, I don't know if anyone can hear you. Maybe I'll like. Oh, you got a mic there?
Yeah, they were both Arsenal players who suffered with drink addiction. You know, they were playing at the top flight of English football, and they were drinking heavily and addicted to alcohol the whole time. Well, some
cool.
of the time.
And sorry, what team do you support?
Portsmouth.
Yeah, you can just tell, can't you? Did you hear the way he said it? Yeah, Arsenal. This is Tony Adams, who used to, when he scored the rare goal, he was the captain of the Arsenal in the 1990s. He would celebrate by making pint sounds. Anyway, he ended up killing somebody in that car accident because he was drunk driving and served, I think it was 11 months in a prison. What he noted in a superb autobiography and an interview that I did with him was that no one helped him. Throughout all his addictive agency problems, there was no one that he could turn to. So he set up an organization, which is still not particularly well-resourced, called Sporting Chance, which deals with the mental health, the addictive problems of athletes. This is something that if we set up in the Netherlands with, again, a tiny percentage of gambling revenue, we can say to the sports people, we're doing it. Why haven't you? Why did it take us to do this rather than you? We're looking after your people. The implication goes better than you are. I think every Dutch person knows who this gentleman is. Have a well-established anti-addiction place in place for them. Again, there are people in this room that know anti-addiction better than me. I'll leave it to you guys. But you've got to tackle this full on. If you don't tackle it full on, your opponents are going to. Right, Patrick Kluivert, national icon and hero, not, in my opinion, anywhere, even in the same book as Johan Cruyff. He's the gospel of Cruyff. But this guy is still a great player. Everyone knows in this room the problems that he ran into with illegal gaming and gambling people and organized crime. He had a debt of almost €1 million and was blackmailed successfully for over 3 years by these guys. We've got to have ways of stopping the future Patrick Kluiverts. We've got to have an effective way, and it's part of that national agency. I'm going to leave you with this final chart and story because it is truly one of the most shocking cases in contemporary European anti-match fixing campaign. It is a current investigation and court trial going on in Reggio Calabria, which is basically, if Italy is a boot, it's right at the toe of the boot. That's Calabria. And that is the organized crime 'Ndrangheta, which is currently at the top of the organized crime chain, higher than the mafia, higher than the Camorra. They are on record as being described as the Maltese Football League as their ATM. They're washing so much cash through the Maltese Football League. Again, this is not a surprise to anybody who follows this kind of stuff. What is a surprise is that executives that are on trial currently in this 'Ndrangheta trial, and they haven't been proved guilty, but they're certainly on trial with all kinds of evidence from the Italian police, they helped sponsor the anti-match fixing campaign that was going on in Malta. They were in the room as this anti-match fixing campaign was going on. What better education could a player have when the executives that are future going to be arrested for 'Ndrangheta involvement, for money laundering, are putting on the anti-match fixing campaign? That is the dire state, ladies and gentlemen, of some of the anti-match fixing work is going on. That's why I call it a failed war at this moment. If you have any questions, any thoughts, anything, I'm happy to share more information in a confidential way. But I want to say, dankjewel, thank you for everything, and God bless us all. Cheers, guys.
Thank you very much, Declan. Yeah, I guess it might be easier if people have got questions now that we wait till the end of the panel, or indeed as the panel's going on.
Sure, I'm happy to talk questions now while people are getting on the stage.
Okay, well, can panelists that are up next come and sit down, and if anyone's got any questions now for Declan, then let's take them from the audience, please. Or you can do it while the panel's going on.
Yes, sir. I see somebody in the back there. Sir. Do you want me to sit on the far end? Yeah. Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, Declan, a question.
What was I saying in Dutch? It was difficult.
I have no idea because I don't speak Dutch.
It was difficult, yeah. There was a lot of cringing going on from the Dutch lads in the front.
Just to introduce myself, David Foster from GVC. What is your impression of the percentage of this corrupt betting that's taking place in illegal markets versus regulated markets? Do you have a view on whether it happens across both, or is it predominantly coming from illegal black markets in Asia and other jurisdictions? What's your impression?
Sorry, let's make sure that we're talking about the same things, because you said corrupted bets. I presume you mean match fixing.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a line that I've repeated constantly since 2005, David. Only stupid people fix on regulated markets. Only dummies fix on a regulated market. Why would you fix on a regulated market if you can go to Asia, which, as everyone knows, they don't care. It's volume, volume, volume. And it's a bunch of sub-agents to national agents to that. So does that mean that there's no match fixing in regulated markets? Yes, there is, but it's the dummies. It's the guys that we can catch very quickly. Or it's the overflow. It's people finding out information from other stuff and going on, and dummies. But that's the thing.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Any more questions from the floor for Declan specifically? Okay.